For decades, the Queen Mother was seen as the unshakable pillar of the British monarchy, a woman of grace, resilience, and unwavering loyalty. But what if her final wish wasn't one of peace, but disruption? What if, hidden behind palace walls, she left behind a truth so explosive that even the crown itself tried to silence it? Tonight, that silence is broken, and nothing will ever be the same again. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The image the world embraced was carefully polished, almost untouchable, a matriarch who steadied the monarchy through war, scandal, and uncertainty. Yet beneath that composed exterior, whispers had always lingered, quiet but persistent, suggesting that her influence extended far beyond ceremonial duties, reaching into decisions never meant for public ears, shaping outcomes from behind closed doors where loyalty was currency and silence was survival. In her final days, something shifted, and those closest to the palace could feel it without fully understanding it, as access to her became increasingly restricted, even senior royals finding themselves held at a distance. Conversations shortened, doors closed earlier than usual, as though something delicate or dangerous was being protected from exposure. Then came the moment that would later haunt the corridors of the monarchy, when King Charles was reportedly handed a sealed document. One that bore not just her authority but an urgency that defied tradition. A message meant for his eyes alone, with no witnesses, no record, no explanation. Only the weight of expectation pressing heavily upon him as he received it. Staff members, long trained to observe without speaking, began noticing subtle but unsettling changes. Late-night meetings that stretched into the early hours. Hushed conversations cut short when footsteps approached. A tension that lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break, suggesting that whatever was unfolding behind those walls was not routine, not ceremonial, but something far more consequential. The idea began to take shape, fragile at first but impossible to ignore, that her final wish had not been shared openly because it was never meant to be, that it challenged something fundamental, something the monarchy had long relied upon to maintain its stability, raising the unsettling possibility that even those within the institution were unprepared to confront it. And as fragments of this hidden narrative began to surface, so did the realization that this was not simply a personal request, not a sentimental farewell, but a calculated directive with the power to reshape succession, to test loyalties, to expose fractures that had been carefully concealed for decades. It begged a question that refused to stay buried, echoing louder with every passing moment. Why would a woman so deeply devoted to tradition choose, in her final act, to disrupt it so profoundly? Unless what she knew demanded it. Unless the truth she carried could no longer be contained. Unless the very foundation of the crown required one last irreversible challenge, and if that was the case, then this was never just about a wish. It was about a reckoning that had been set in motion long before her final breath, waiting patiently for the moment it could no longer be ignored. But to understand why this revelation is so devastating, we must go back deep into the Queen Mother's past, where the seeds of this final wish were quietly planted. To the world, she was a comforting symbol, a grandmotherly figure wrapped in pearls and tradition. But behind palace doors, the Queen Mother was something else entirely. A strategist, a gatekeeper, and perhaps the most influential shadow in royal history. What if her real power wasn't in what she showed, but in what she controlled? And what if that power never truly disappeared? Because as we trace the origins of her final wish, a far more complex portrait begins to emerge, one that was never meant for public consumption. One that reveals a woman who understood the monarchy not just as a legacy to preserve, but as a structure to shape, guide, and, when necessary, quietly manipulate from within. Her influence was never formally declared, yet it was deeply felt in moments of crisis, when decisions seemed to shift without explanation, when outcomes aligned with a quiet, unseen authority that few dared to question, suggesting that her presence extended far beyond ceremonial appearances into the very core of royal strategy. Those who operated within her orbit spoke in careful tones, hinting at connections that reached into political circles, advisory networks, and private confidants whose roles were never acknowledged publicly. Alliances built not on visibility, but on trust and discretion, allowing her to remain both central and invisible at the same time. And within the family itself, her hand was said to guide matters far more personal, intervening in relationships, influencing choices of partnership, subtly redirecting paths that might otherwise have unfolded differently, all under the guise of protecting the crown while quietly redefining its future. Nowhere was this influence more deeply embedded than in her relationship with Charles, where guidance often blurred into expectation, and support carried an undercurrent of evaluation, shaping not only his role as heir, but the emotional framework through which he understood duty, loyalty, and identity. It is within this dynamic that a more unsettling possibility begins to take shape, that she was not merely observing the evolution of the monarchy, but documenting it, preserving letters, conversations, and moments that held significance beyond their immediate context, creating a private archive of truths that could one day serve a purpose far greater than memory. And if that is true, then her final wish begins to look less like a sudden decision and more like the culmination of years, perhaps decades, of careful observation, a conclusion drawn from patterns only she had fully seen, a decision formed not in haste but in certainty. This was a woman who understood timing, who knew when silence served her and when revelation could not be delayed, and as the pieces begin to align, it becomes increasingly difficult to ignore the possibility that everything she did was leading to one final decisive move, one that would force the monarchy to confront something it had long avoided. Because if her influence was as vast as it now appears, then her last act was never going to be simple, never going to be safe, and certainly never going to be easily contained, and that realization brings us closer to the heart of the matter, where influence meets consequence, where intention meets revelation, and where the figure at the center of it all begins to feel the full weight of what she left behind. And at the center of it all stood one man, the heir she both protected and perhaps never fully trusted. King Charles spent his life preparing for the crown, but not for this. Raised under the watchful eye of the Queen Mother, he was shaped, guided, and perhaps quietly judged. But what happens when the very woman who helped define your destiny leaves behind a message that could unravel everything you've become? For Charles, this wasn't just a revelation, it was a reckoning. Because long before he ever wore the crown, before the weight of expectation became visible to the world, his life had already been carefully influenced by a presence that demanded both strength and silence. A presence that offered protection but never without pressure, shaping him into an heir who understood duty but was never fully free from doubt. Their relationship was layered, complex, built on admiration that often blurred into quiet tension, where approval was never openly denied yet never entirely assured, leaving Charles to navigate a path where every decision felt observed, every hesitation quietly noted, and every weakness something to be managed rather than revealed. And so, when that sealed message reached him, it did not arrive as a simple farewell, it arrived as the culmination of a lifetime of unspoken expectations, pressing down on him in a way that no public duty ever had, forcing him to confront not just what she wanted, but what he had become under her influence. There were no advisors in that moment, no counsel to share the burden. Only the silence of realization as he understood that whatever was written inside that message had been meant for him alone, a private truth that could not be diluted or deferred, a directive that demanded personal reckoning. Before any royal response, in the days that followed, something changed, subtle at first but impossible to ignore, as those closest to him began to notice a distance that had not been there before, a withdrawal that suggested not weakness but conflict, as though he was carrying a decision too heavy to reveal and too urgent to ignore. The public saw composure, as they always had, but behind that composure there were signs, moments of hesitation, shifts in tone, an absence of certainty that hinted at something far deeper unfolding beneath the surface. Speculation began to build quietly, fueled by the growing awareness that whatever the Queen Mother had asked of him was not aligned with the path he had already begun to take as king, raising the possibility that fulfilling her wish would require him to confront choices he had already made, alliances he had already formed, and a version of the monarchy he had already committed to shaping. And that is where the tension sharpens. Because this is no longer just about honoring the past, it is about deciding which version of the future he is willing to risk, whether he can carry forward her vision without dismantling his own, or whether protecting the institution means turning away from the very woman who helped define it for him. It is a conflict that cannot be resolved without consequence, a decision that cannot be delayed without cost. And as the pressure builds, the realization becomes unavoidable. A king is being forced to choose between loyalty and truth, between legacy and stability, between what was asked of him and what he believes must be protected. And somewhere within that conflict lies the deeper question, one that grows louder with every passing moment, one that refuses to be silenced. What exactly did the Queen Mother ask of him, and why has it been kept hidden for so long? It wasn't a letter of farewell. It wasn't a blessing. According to insiders, the Queen Mother's final wish was something far more dangerous, a directive that could rewrite royal history. A wish so controversial, so destabilizing that it was immediately locked away. But now, fragments are emerging, and what they reveal is nothing short of astonishing. Because what Charles read in that moment was not comfort, not closure, but a demand clear, deliberate, and impossible to ignore, one that reached into the very structure of the monarchy and questioned truths that had long been accepted without challenge. At the heart of it, whispers suggest, was a call to correct something buried, something deliberately overlooked, a demand tied to succession, recognition, or a hidden truth that had been protected for generations, raising the possibility that the story the public believed was never the full story at all. And if that is true, then what she left behind was not simply a personal request, but a direct challenge to the official narrative itself, one that threatens to unravel carefully constructed histories and expose fractures that were never meant to be seen. The most unsettling part is not just what the wish contains, but who it may involve, because emerging speculation points toward a figure long kept at the edges of royal memory, someone sidelined, overlooked, or quietly removed from relevance, now being drawn back into the center of attention by a directive that refuses to be ignored. And that possibility alone is enough to send shockwaves through an institution built on continuity and control. Because bringing such a figure forward would not just raise questions, it would demand answers, forcing the monarchy to confront decisions made in silence and justify actions that were never meant to face public scrutiny. Inside the palace, the reaction was immediate and intense, not with public statements, but with silence, calculated, deliberate, and revealing in its absence of clarity, as senior figures retreated into private discussions, weighing the risks, debating the consequences, and trying to determine whether this wish should ever be acknowledged at all. It was containment at its highest level, an effort to hold back something that was already beginning to push against the boundaries of secrecy. Because once such a truth begins to surface, it cannot be easily controlled. And at the center of this growing tension stood Charles, caught in a moment where hesitation became inevitable. Because revealing the contents of that wish would not just impact the monarchy's present, it would redefine its past. And that is a risk no institution takes lightly. His silence was not weakness. It was calculation, a pause driven by the understanding that once this truth is spoken, it cannot be taken back, that every word would carry consequences far beyond his reign, far beyond his own legacy. But something shifted, something forced movement where there had been restraint, suggesting that the pressure to reveal at least part of the truth had grown too strong to ignore, whether from within the palace or beyond it, leaving him with fewer options and less time. Because the deeper implication of this wish is not just its content, but its intention. It feels less like a final request and more like a deliberate test, a challenge designed to force a decision that could not be avoided, placing Charles in a position where any choice would come with sacrifice. Honor it and risk destabilizing everything. Ignore it and risk betraying the very legacy he was raised to protect. And that is where the true weight of her final act begins to reveal itself, not as guidance but as pressure, not as closure, but as confrontation. A final move that ensures the monarchy cannot remain unchanged. And as the truth began to circulate within palace walls, it didn't unite the family, it divided them. The royal family has weathered scandals before, but nothing like this. As whispers of the Queen Mother's final wish spread, loyalties began to shift. Conversations turned into confrontations. And for the first time in years, the unity of the monarchy appeared dangerously fragile. What was once hidden was now threatening to tear everything apart. Because inside the palace, the reaction was not one of quiet acceptance, but of rising tension, as the implications of that final wish began to settle into the minds of those who understood exactly what was at stake, forcing each member of the royal household to confront a question they had never expected to face. Should this truth be honored, or should it be buried before it destroys everything they have spent their lives protecting? The divide did not happen all at once. It crept in slowly, through guarded conversations and exchanged glances, through meetings that grew longer and more strained, where agreement became impossible and silence began to carry more weight than words, revealing fractures that had long existed but had never been pushed to the surface with such force. Some saw the wish as a duty, an obligation that could not be ignored without betraying the very legacy the Queen Mother had spent her life preserving, while others viewed it as a threat, a destabilizing force that could unravel the monarchy's carefully constructed image in a way that no recovery plan could contain. And at the center of these opposing views stood Charles, no longer just a king, but a man caught between competing loyalties, facing pressure not only from the weight of history but from those closest to him, each urging him toward a different path, each convinced that their version of loyalty was the one that must prevail. Tension with key figures within the family became increasingly difficult to conceal, as disagreements sharpened into quiet confrontations, where respect remained on the surface but trust began to erode beneath it, leaving behind a fragile balance that could collapse at any moment. The fear was no longer theoretical, it was immediate, urgent, and deeply personal, because if the truth behind the Queen Mother's final wish were to become public, it would not simply raise questions, it would challenge credibility, forcing the monarchy to defend not just its present decisions but its past actions, opening doors that had been sealed for generations. And in response to that fear, there were those who pushed for complete suppression, who believed that silence was the only way forward, that some truths were too dangerous to be acknowledged, even if they came from within the very heart of the institution itself. But not everyone agreed, and that disagreement became emotional, charged with a sense of betrayal, as some began to question whether protecting the crown meant protecting its image at all costs, or whether it meant confronting the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Shock gave way to disbelief, disbelief to frustration, and frustration to something deeper, a realization that this was no longer just about a wish, but about what the monarchy stood for, and whether it could survive the exposure of something it had worked so hard to conceal. As these tensions grew, the royal household began to split into factions, not formally declared but unmistakably present, with alliances forming around opposing visions of what must be done, creating an atmosphere where unity was no longer assumed, but uncertain, fragile, and constantly at risk of breaking. And as the pressure continued to build from within, a more unsettling thought began to take hold. One that could not be easily dismissed, that the monarchy's greatest threat was no longer external criticism or public scrutiny, but the conflict now unfolding behind its own walls, where loyalty itself had become divided, and where the outcome of this internal struggle could determine not just the fate of a single decision, but the future of the institution itself. But as the palace struggled to contain the fallout, the outside world began to catch on. No secret stays hidden forever, especially one this explosive. Despite the palace's efforts, details of the Queen Mother's final wish began to leak. Quietly at first, then louder. Journalists, insiders, and unnamed sources started piecing together a story the monarchy never wanted told. And once it was out, there was no turning back. What began as faint murmurs within tightly controlled media circles quickly evolved into something far more dangerous, as fragments of information slipped through cracks that should never have existed, carried by voices that refused to stay silent, hinting at a truth too significant to remain buried. At first, the whispers were cautious, almost hesitant, circulating among elite journalists who understood the weight of what they were hearing, but lacked confirmation strong enough to bring it fully into the light. Yet even in that uncertainty, there was a sense that something unprecedented was unfolding behind palace walls. Then came the anonymous sources, carefully worded, deliberately vague, but impossible to ignore, speaking of internal conflict at a level rarely seen, suggesting that the monarchy was not simply managing a private matter, but struggling to contain something that threatened to expose divisions at its very core. And as those hints began to align, a pattern emerged. one that pointed toward a coordinated effort not just to suppress information, but to control how and when it might surface, raising an unsettling question: were these leaks accidental, or were they intentional, driven by individuals within the system who believed the truth needed to be forced into the open? Because the consistency of the narrative, the way separate pieces seemed to connect without direct confirmation, suggested that someone, somewhere, was guiding the flow of information, revealing just enough to spark curiosity, but not enough to provide clarity, creating a tension that the public could not resist. And once that curiosity took hold, it spread rapidly, moving beyond exclusive circles into broader conversations, capturing attention across platforms and audiences, transforming quiet speculation into global fascination, as people began asking the same question: what could be so powerful that the monarchy itself is struggling to contain it? The palace, long accustomed to managing public perception with precision, found itself reacting rather than controlling, issuing carefully measured responses that said little but revealed everything in their restraint, as the absence of denial became just as telling as any confirmation. Efforts to redirect attention, to minimize the significance of what was being suggested, only seemed to intensify interest, as each attempt at silence created more space for interpretation, more room for speculation, pushing the story further into the spotlight rather than pulling it back into the shadows. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, the situation crossed a threshold, a point where the story was no longer confined to whispers or hints, but had taken on a life of its own, fueled by growing belief that something real, something deeply consequential, was being deliberately concealed. That was the moment everything changed, when containment became impossible, when the narrative escaped the boundaries of control and entered a space where it could no longer be shaped, only reacted to. Because once the idea took hold that the Queen Mother's final wish was more than a personal matter, that it carried implications capable of reshaping the monarchy itself, the question was no longer whether it would be revealed, but how much would be revealed, and how soon. And as that realization spread, so did the anticipation, building toward an inevitable confrontation between what had been hidden and what could no longer be denied, setting the stage for a reaction that would extend far beyond the palace walls. And when the public finally began to understand what was at stake, the reaction was immediate and intense. The British monarchy has always relied on public trust, but what happens when that trust is shaken? As the Queen Mother's final wish became a topic of global conversation, reactions poured in: shock, anger, sympathy, confusion. For many, it wasn't just about the monarchy anymore, it was about truth, legacy, and the future of an institution millions have grown up believing in. What had once been contained within palace walls was now unfolding in real time before a global audience, and the response was anything but unified, as people from every corner of the world began interpreting the situation through their own beliefs about tradition, power, and accountability. Some voices rose in support of transparency, insisting that if the monarchy truly represented integrity, then no truth, no matter how uncomfortable, should remain hidden, arguing that the Queen Mother's final wish, whatever it contained, deserved to be honored openly as a matter of principle. Others pushed back just as strongly, defending the importance of tradition, warning that exposing internal matters could damage not only the institution, but the sense of continuity that millions still held onto, creating a divide that was no longer quiet or contained, but visible and deeply emotional. This divide quickly found its way into media discussions, where analysts, commentators, and historians began dissecting every possible implication, turning speculation into structured debate, each perspective adding another layer to a narrative that was becoming increasingly difficult to control. And as these conversations intensified, social media amplified them even further, transforming individual reactions into collective movements, where theories spread rapidly, emotions escalated without restraint, and the line between fact and interpretation blurred, making it nearly impossible to separate what was known from what was believed. In that environment, the monarchy's image faced a challenge unlike any it had encountered in decades, not because of a single event, but because of the uncertainty surrounding it, the sense that something significant was being withheld, creating a tension that could not be easily resolved through silence, or carefully crafted statements. For younger generations especially, this moment began to feel like a turning point, prompting questions not just about what the Queen Mother's final wish contained, but about the broader relevance of the monarchy itself, whether it could continue to command trust in a world that increasingly demanded openness and accountability. And yet, even as skepticism grew, so did fascination, as audiences around the globe became deeply invested in the unfolding story, following each development with a mix of curiosity and anticipation, drawn in by the possibility that they were witnessing a moment that could redefine an institution that had stood for generations. The narrative was no longer confined to insiders or observers. It had become a shared experience, one that carried emotional weight for people who had never before questioned the monarchy so directly. And with that shift came a realization that could not be ignored, that whatever decision would be made next would not exist in isolation. It would resonate far beyond the palace, shaping perceptions, influencing trust, and potentially altering the course of the monarchy's future in ways that could not be reversed. Because this was no longer just a private matter or a historical footnote, it was a defining moment, one where the balance between tradition and truth would be tested under the scrutiny of the entire world. And as that pressure reached its peak, one truth became impossible to escape. The final decision now carried consequences far beyond the palace walls, extending into the very foundation of what the monarchy represented. With the world watching, King Charles faced the most difficult decision of his reign. In the end, it all came down to one man and one choice. King Charles stood at the crossroads of history, holding a secret that could either honor his grandmother's final wish or protect the monarchy from irreversible damage. But no matter what he chose, the consequences would be monumental, because some truths don't just change history, they redefine it. And in that moment, stripped of ceremony and surrounded by the weight of everything he had inherited, Charles was no longer just a king fulfilling a role, but a man confronting a decision that cut through generations of loyalty, expectation, and silence, forcing him to face the reality that the path forward would demand more than duty, it would demand sacrifice. The conflict within him had been building quietly, intensifying with each passing day as the pressure from within the palace collided with the scrutiny from beyond it, leaving him caught between two forces that could not be reconciled without consequence, each pulling him toward a different version of truth. On one side stood legacy, the promise to uphold what had been carefully preserved, to protect the institution that had defined his life, to maintain stability in a world already watching too closely for signs of weakness. On the other side stood the risk of upheaval, the understanding that honoring the Queen Mother's final wish could expose fractures, challenge narratives, and force the monarchy into a moment of reckoning it may not be prepared to endure. And surrounding him were voices, not united but divided. Advisors offering conflicting guidance, some urging caution, insisting that silence remained the strongest defense, while others warned that silence was no longer sustainable, that the truth had already begun to surface, and that delaying the inevitable would only deepen the impact when it finally emerged. Each perspective carried its own logic, its own fear, its own vision of what must be preserved and what could be risked, leaving Charles with no clear path, only choices that came with consequences he could not fully predict. Yet beneath the political calculations and strategic considerations, there was something far more personal at stake, an emotional burden that could not be shared or delegated. Because at the heart of this decision was the Queen Mother herself, a figure who had shaped him, guided him, and now in her final act, placed him in a position where honoring her could mean destabilizing everything she had once protected. To defy her would be to break from that influence, to assert a different vision, but at the cost of carrying the knowledge that he had turned away from her last request. To follow her would be to embrace a truth that could reshape the monarchy in ways no one could fully control. And as that realization settled in, another truth began to emerge. Quieter but far more unsettling, that silence, once the monarchy's greatest shield, was no longer an option, because the story had already begun to unfold beyond its control, and whatever decision he made would not remain hidden for long. This was no longer about choosing whether to act, but how to act, knowing that every path forward would lead to transformation, whether gradual or immediate, controlled or chaotic. And then, just as the weight of the moment reached its peak, a final, chilling possibility began to take shape. One that reframed everything that the Queen Mother had not only anticipated this dilemma, but had designed it. That her final wish was never meant to provide clarity, but to force a choice that could not be avoided, ensuring that the monarchy would be confronted with a moment of truth whether it was ready or not. And if that is the case, then this was never just a decision placed in Charles's hands, it was a test, carefully constructed, deliberately timed, and impossible to escape. And as the dust begins to settle, one question remains: was this her final act of protection, or her most calculated move yet? History remembers monarchs for what they build, but sometimes it's what they leave behind that matters most. The Queen Mother's final wish was never meant to fade quietly into the past. It was meant to echo, to challenge, to disrupt, and to force the monarchy to confront itself. And now, as the truth lingers, one thing is certain: the crown will never be the same again. Because what began as a hidden directive, sealed in silence and guarded by tradition, has now transformed into something far greater, a defining moment that stretches beyond individuals and reaches into the very identity of the monarchy itself. This is no longer just a story about one decision or one revelation. It is about the lasting imprint of a choice that cannot be undone, one that will shape how the crown is understood for generations to come. The implications are not immediate alone, they are enduring, weaving themselves into the fabric of royal legacy, altering how history will remember not only the Queen Mother, but Charles, and the institution they both served in very different ways. What was once seen as unshakable now carries a new complexity, as the idea of absolute stability gives way to something more uncertain, more human, more exposed. Public perception, once guided by carefully maintained narratives, has shifted, no longer anchored solely in tradition but influenced by the knowledge that even the most revered figures carried truths that could challenge everything they represented. And within that shift lies a deeper transformation, as the monarchy is no longer viewed as an untouchable symbol, but as an evolving institution, one capable of being questioned, redefined, and, perhaps, reshaped by the very forces it once sought to control. The Queen Mother's final wish now stands as both a challenge and a warning, a message that transcends its immediate impact, suggesting that even the strongest foundations must eventually confront the truths they were built upon. For Charles, this moment becomes inseparable from his reign, a defining chapter that will follow him long after the immediate consequences have settled, binding his legacy to a decision that required not just leadership, but courage in the face of uncertainty. Whether seen as an act of preservation or a step toward transformation, his choice will not be judged in isolation, but through the lens of what it reveals about the monarchy's willingness to face itself honestly. And as time moves forward, this moment will not fade into obscurity, it will stand as a turning point, one that future generations will look back on as the moment when the crown was forced to confront its own reflection, to decide whether it would remain unchanged or evolve under the weight of truth. Yet even now, as the immediate tension begins to ease, one question refuses to disappear. Lingering in the background like an unresolved echo, was this truth necessary? A moment of clarity that the monarchy needed to endure? Or was it a disruption so profound that it altered something that could never be restored? The answer may never be fully known, because the impact of such a revelation is not confined to a single moment. It unfolds over time, reshaping perspectives, redefining loyalties, and challenging assumptions in ways that cannot be predicted. And in that uncertainty lies the final, most powerful realization of all, that the crown, for all its history and resilience, is not immune to change, that even its most enduring symbols can be redefined by a single act of truth. The monarchy endures as it always has, but it does so carrying the weight of what has been revealed, forever marked by a moment that refused to remain hidden. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is that this was exactly what she intended. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.